Can the government salvage the Rwanda plan? Will cutting immigration mean we don't have enough care workers? And Keir Starmer wants to build a lot of homes. Will his MPs let him? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Tim Lawton, Labour MP Rupa Huck, James Heal from The Spectator and Rachel Cunliffe from The New Statesman. Today, the Home Secretary is in Rwanda to sign a new treaty, but will the plan to send migrants there ever happen?
We want to end the merry-go-round. We want to stop those excessive, often spurious legal challenges that arise at the last minute.
And what will government plans to cut immigration mean for social care?
People having care in their own homes won't be able to get the care they need because the staff aren't there.
There will be women and men, children and families in every constituency of this House whose lives have been forever touched by the infected blood scandal of the 1970s and the 1980s.
The Prime Minister suffers his first defeat in the Commons as MPs vote to speed up compensation for contaminated blood victims.
Today we launch a new plan to get Britain building again, a signal of our determination to fight the blockers who hold a veto over British aspiration.
Keir Starmer says he'll bulldoze through local opposition to new homes, but are his MPs on board? Let's start with this headline in the Financial Times and the story you heard there in our headlines, which is the Home Secretary James Cleverly to sign new Rwanda treaty in effort to revive asylum plan. Yes, the Home Secretary, the third Home Secretary, in fact, to go to Rwanda in the last 18 months. He flew out early this morning, arrived in the capital, Kigali, waiting to sign a beefed-up treaty aimed at addressing concerns in the Supreme Court ruling last month. Before that signing takes place, you can see him here looking at pictures, images of the victims of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. He is at the Kigali Genocide Memorial Museum. We're expecting the signing to take place at around 1 o'clock today. But first of all, let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, who joins us now. Hello to you, Henry. What is James Cleverly hoping to achieve today?
There's two things the government thinks it needs to do if it can get its Rwanda policy back on track. Because, of course, just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court declared that it, as it stands, is unlawful. And that was a fairly comprehensive verdict on on a fair number of different fronts. So what James Cleverly is doing in Rwanda today is trying to upgrade the legal status of the deal that the UK government has had with the Rwandan government for some time. At the moment, it's a memorandum of understanding that the Rwandan process would work in various different ways should the UK ever be able to deport asylum seekers there. Today, that's going to become a treaty with a flick of James Cleverly's pen and that of his Rwandan counterpart, and the government thinks that will put it on a surer legal footing. But that's not it. Then when James Cleverly comes back to the UK, we're expecting the government to unveil what they call emergency legislation, which they hope will constrain the ability of asylum seekers who may be deported to Rwanda to challenge that deportation process. And of course, it was legal challenges of that sort which bogged it down and ultimately resulted in the policy going to the Supreme Court and being declared unlawful in the first place.
Henry, do we know the detail of what the government or what their preferred option is in terms of limiting those legal challenges?
We don't yet, and I think there are divisions, not just within the Conservative Party, but also within the government on how strong that legislation should be. So there's a spectrum of potential options. At the most sort of severe, radical, whatever word you want to use, end, you could see the government deciding to disapply European human rights laws for the purposes of asylum claims. That's what's sometimes known as a notwithstanding clause. It's what Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, was and is advocating now she's out of government. A slightly more moderate option would see the government disapplying the UK's human rights laws for the purposes of asylum claims. And then perhaps a different option, if the government decides not to go through with either of those things, would be for the government to, or for Parliament via legislation, to assert its view that Rwanda is a safe country, and hope that the courts here take heed of that.
Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. And just a reminder that we're expecting the signing of that treaty to take place in about 45 minutes' time. In the meantime, let's talk to our guest. Starting with you, Tim, will the Rwanda plan ever happen?
I hope so, because it's an important part of the jigsaw of how we deal with people coming into the country illegally across the Channel in particular, and for those coming from countries for whom it's really hard to return them to those countries. It's also a bit of a test of credibility. The government's put a lot of store by the Rwanda
Yeah, it's one of its key
plan.
pledges.
It shouldn't have been knocked out in the Supreme Court because, frankly, more detail, I think, should have been put in when it was actually designed in the first place. That's what I hope now James Cleverly is able to sort out with this new treaty, to make it proof of going through courts and legal challenges in the future. But there's still quite a lot of work to be done.
Rupa, will it ever happen? Will flights take off for Rwanda with asylum seekers?
I mean, at the moment, there seem to be more Home Secretaries going to Rwanda than actually people going to Rwanda to be processed there. And it just looks a bit desperate, doesn't it? I mean, they keep saying the asylum system's broken. They've been in for 13 years. Who broke it? And this shouldn't be necessary. We've got a huge backlog. I think the Supreme Court said that this is only fit for 100, the capacity, 100 people. And there's about 100,000 on the waiting list. Labour is saying that we would get 1,000 new caseworkers. As MPs, we do immigration casework. People are waiting for years and years for decisions. So, I mean, we always said it was a bit immoral, you know, these people fleeing who knows what, persecution, whatever, unworkable. Other countries where they've tried it, they've had to abandon it.
Sure.
And
so you don't think it will happen?
I think there goes a pig. I mean, I literally cannot foresee anything happening before the election. They're ramming it through.
So what do you do?
Right, well, Tim's asked the question. What will you do?
So what do you do with those people who come to this country knowing that there is very little prospect of them being returned to the country from which they come if their claim is not upheld? If you come from Iran, the Iranian government won't let you off the plane if you're trying to return them. In Eritrea, you'll end up in jail. There are certain countries where it's impossible to return those people, even though their claim for asylum in the country has been absolutely turned down. We have a duty of care to those who have credible asylum claims, but for those who don't, who are gaming the system, who are paying people smugglers, it's a one-way trip, and that's not fair to the genuine asylum seekers or to the British taxpayer, which is why Rwanda is the only way to try and deter some of those people coming over the Channel in the first place.
I think James Cleverly said it's not the be-all and end-all.
It isn't.
There has been some success with the bilateral agreements with people like
Albania.
France. So, you know, there has been, but they've set all their eggs in this one basket. It's their flagship policy.
You've just said they have said it's not the be-all and end-all. But what would Labour do? What would Labour do as an alternative? Sort out the backlog, because there's 100,000 plus people whose cases need processing. Because it's very also expensive putting people in hotels. Sure. There's all these knock-on effects. It's just a mess, this, and it's playing to the gallery. I mean, considering they had a majority of 80 not long ago, they're doing this for their right-wing back. Well, it has been criticised as a gimmick. Do you think it'll ever actually happen?
I think I'm a bit sceptical in terms of for the next election. I think the enemy of all the different plans here is time, and what can you get done in the next 12 months or so. I think, according to the reports, even the most optimistic suggestions are that it'll be around April, May. Then you have to counter into fact you've got judicial and institutional resistance as well. And I therefore think it's going to be unlikely before an election. I think, you talk about backlog, for instance, and there's obviously a very important issue to deal with. But the question is that will take, I think, months, if not years, to deal with. And so I think that's the enemy of all different schemes here. So we wait to see if anything will happen. But I would say that overall this process has been characterised by a bit of an optimism bias. And so I think that needs to be taken into account.
Do you think it'll happen?
Not before the next election, for all the reasons that James outlined. I also think it's become totemic for the Conservatives wanting to look like they have a grip on this, even though, as has already been discussed, it's a very small number of asylum seekers who would be sent there. And I just want to sort of pick up on something.
The idea is it's a deterrent.
The idea is a deterrent, but Tim pointed out that we do have a duty of care to genuine asylum seekers. The plan as it currently stands would send all asylum seekers or asylum seekers regardless of their claim to be processed in Rwanda. It's not a case of if your claim got rejected here, you'd be sent there, and you could have your claim processed in Rwanda, you could be found to have a genuine asylum claim and then stay in Rwanda. So I think we should be very, very clear that this isn't about people who have been found to come here under false pretences. This refers to genuine asylum seekers too, genuine asylum seekers who cannot come to the UK via a safe and legal route, because safe and legal routes for claiming asylum for the vast majority of countries do not exist.
Which is why safe and legal routes are an important part of the jigsaw as well. included in the illegal migration bill, because of an amendment which I led on, where the government is committed and obliged to bring in those safe and legal routes, in addition to the few that there are at the moment, next year.
Right. Are you confident that's going to happen?
It has to happen.
Right.
They're obliged by legislation to do it.
And
they're working on it now.
Just give us an idea of the list of countries.
It's not about the list of countries, it's about ways in which you can apply outside of the UK if you think you have a credible claim, for then to come to the UK and have that claim advanced.
Right.
There are various ways of doing that. It's about extending countries from which you can do that. It's about allowing certain countries to be able to do it perhaps through embassies or consulates from a neighbouring country where somebody's escaped from a war zone.
Yeah, sure. And you're confident that that will be put in place
it.
next year and people will be able to start to come from the sorts of countries that you've talked about?
That's what the Commons and the Lords voted on in the legal migration bill earlier this year. The government is obliged to do it and to have it working before the end of next year.
Well, let's go back to the Rwanda plan, because that's where we started. You heard there Henry Zeffman set out the options in terms of that emergency legislation to reduce or minimise the opportunity for court challenges, either here or in Europe. Which option do you prefer, Tim?
Well, we don't know what the full range of options are because we don't know what's in the treaty, which hasn't been signed yet.
Let me give you the three that we're
legislation.
expecting. There could be a simple bill. There could be I agree this is to some extent speculation, but it's been pretty widely reported. There could be a simple bill that just says we deem Rwanda to be a safe country to send asylum seekers to, and the treaty will set that out. Or, as Henry said, we could disapply parts of UK legislation when it comes to asylum cases, and that would reduce the chance of challenge. Or we do it with the European Convention on Human Rights and other international treaties. Which do you think would be the best?
OK, so I don't prefer options which in any way undermine our membership of the European Convention.
Okay.
I think there are reforms that we need to the ECHR, which many other countries would like to see as well. There's a particular problem around the Article 39 directions, which is what's responsible for stopping aeroplanes taking off in the first place. They are not part of the ECHR Convention. They never have been. Many other countries are concerned about them, and the Strasbourg Court just a few weeks ago itself announced that they are going to look again at the way they apply those. So it's not a be-all and end-all. There's reform that needs there. In terms of recognising Rwanda as a safe country, this would just be using the legislation that the Labour government used in 2004 and the Asylum Act there, where it designated safe and legal.
Yeah, but this is in response to, obviously, the concerns raised by the Supreme Court ruling that it isn't a safe country, and they were pretty expansive, the list of the Supreme Court. No, I understand where your reservations are, and we'll have to wait and see.
It's not a novel model. It's been done before. We're extending it to Rwanda, where the UN itself sends migrants and believe it to be safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was originally, do you remember, a distraction from Partygate. So they've made this thing, they've marched themselves up to the top of the hill. They've set so much store by it that it's difficult to march themselves down again. The bilateral stuff is working. There are other ways of doing this. It's very expensive. I think 140 million.
Well, and more money is being paid.
15 million today. It's going up and up. And at a time when we should be justifying every penny of taxpayer.
How do you have a bilateral agreement with Iran or Eritrea?
Well, I just think this is just a dud, this thing. Everyone's saying so. Theresa May said so. It puts all her modern slavery reforms in jeopardy.
Well, and just
finally,
but Tim,
how do you have an agreement with those
hang on. But just finally, if planes don't take off to Rwanda next year, since it's been one of the key pledges from Rishi Sunak, how much damage will that do to the Conservatives and the government?
Well, we know, so Home Affairs Select Committee went to Calais earlier in the year, and we heard from the authorities there that when the government announced the Rwanda scheme last year, there was a surge of migrants approaching the authorities to try and regularise their status. So we know it would act as a deterrent.
Yeah, but if you fail to do it, what would be the hit electorally?
Well, then we have to look at other alternatives to Rwanda. And it's not just Rwanda. There's a whole raft of other countries who are potentially interested in engaging in.
But as James said, the timing is probably not going to work before the next general election. Now, that is about dealing with small boat crossings. Let's have a look at legal migration, because before James Cleverly went off to Rwanda. He was in the Commons yesterday, responding and giving a statement on those net migration figures that have reached a record high. He pledged this, the front page of the Daily Mail, biggest ever clampdown will slash migration by 300,000. He has a 5-point plan. Sound familiar? Everyone's got a 5-point plan at the moment, and they include raising the minimum salary needed for skilled overseas workers by a third to nearly £39,000 and a curb on dependence for social care workers coming here to work. They will be exempt, by the way, from the hike in minimum salary that is necessary. But if you have a look here, the Times say curbs make it harder to care for most vulnerable, say NHS bosses. Well, let's get a flavour of the possible impact with Nadra Ahmed from the National Care Association, which represents small and medium-sized care providers. What will the impact be, Nadra, on restricting or having a curb on dependence for social care workers from abroad?
Well, I think it will have an impact from the perspective that people will be less likely to choose us as the country to come to. And these will be people who are probably the ones we want, the more highly skilled, the ones that have got that background in care, because they could go to another country where they would where their families would be welcome, and the importance of having that love and support from somebody when you're doing a job that is distressful, which it can be, as we all know, will be the tipping point in decision making.
Right, and how reliant is the care system on workers from abroad?
I think because we cannot get a domestic workforce at the moment for love nor money, the reality is that would be our preferred option, is to have a pool of domestic workforce that would come in and take over that role. Well, 2 years before the pandemic hit, we knew those figures were going up, and that was partially due to Brexit. So what we do know is the figures are not really looking very good. We've still got 152,000 vacancies. What we have is a workforce of 1.6 million people, and 70,000 of those are international recruits. So if we want to clear those voids and make sure that we can deliver the health and support that is required for a nation of an ageing population,
yes,
more vulnerability available, then we've got to do something. We've got to do it quickly. And this was the fix.
Nadra, how many foreign care workers want to bring dependents, family members?
Well, I think it depends on how long they're going to commit to, how long they're going to be here. But the vast majority will want somebody with them. And I think you've got to look at the humane aspect of this. This is a stressful job. We're looking after people at the end of life care. We've got high levels of dementia. People are coming into the country to help and support us. They will have qualifications. They will be skilled. They'll have to go through some training. And at the end of the day, they will go home to an empty building. And that feels really wrong.
Right.
Most of us go home and we have somebody after a hard day to look after us. But to do that, you know, day on day, month on month, year on year, just seems totally unreasonable.
Nadra, stay with us. Tim, on that point, isn't it unreasonable? It's inhumane to expect foreign workers to come here and fill these jobs, but say you cannot bring family members in the way that you could.
OK, 2 points. Over 20 years ago at Worthing Hospital, we had a real shortage of nurses, as we did nationally at that time. And the managers scoured the world to try and find a new workforce. In the end, we brought in a load of nurses from the Philippines. The Philippines train more nurses than they need, really good nurses. They didn't all bring their families with them. They've settled, integrated really well in the local community. They are fantastic nurses. The second problem is the number of dependent visas issued last year was 7 times higher than in 2020. There are now stories of people getting visas to work in care homes that don't exist, and of people traffickers matching up dependents with no connections to those who have got visas to get them a visa.
All right, well,
there's a racket that needs to be tackled.
All right, well,
as
as you say,
issue.
these are two separate things. Nadra, do you want to respond? Oh, hang on just a moment. We're just going to... I don't know if you might have...
Sorry, that was just me. That was me.
Go ahead.
That was me. I do want to respond. It's a really good point, and you've made a really good point. But it's you that got it wrong. The government got it wrong. You were handing out visas without checking if people were in care settings. What you did was you opened the floodgates to unregistered services who could set up agencies who had no registration to enable them to bring people in. And they actually did that by going into these countries and preying on people who were paying huge amounts of money thinking they were coming in to help the social care sector, and there was no job to come to. So thank God you've listened to us and now have CQC registered providers only.
And on that point, though, do you think it is inhumane to ask them to come over? You didn't answer that particular point, which is what both NADRA have said, but also NHS employees. It's a perverse on a human level to ask people to come to the UK and provide vital service in our communities and then saying you can't bring your kids.
I don't think it's inhumane is the term I would use. And as I've said, it did not deter people coming in for nursing as well.
Well, let me get the
have got a big problem, and we need more homegrown workers and better training.
Well, we'll come on to that in a moment.
But
what's your response, first of all, to the measures? Hiking the minimum threshold. They've also, the government listened to Labour in terms of scrapping the 20% discount and asking people to fill these jobs but not bring family members.
We always said the 20% was unfair, that you can undercut.
Well, you've got that.
And they're reversing their own policies. It just shows how desperate they are. I think we do need an election. This lot have run out of ideas. They're all over the shop. And what I'd say is this almost 38,000 figure does sound high, but it was 4 years ago 26,000 was set, so maybe put it back to the Migration Advisory Committee because they are the independent expert body. Get them to determine a figure. Just seems this has been a bit plucked out of the air. I don't understand the workings of raising it by a third. And it's an extra barrier. Inhumane may not be the word, but it is an extra barrier. And it's not just the care sector, it's construction, also hospitality.
Oh, the shortage occupation lists are huge.
Yeah, I think social care is one of the many problems we have allowed to develop over long term. I mean, Boris Johnson pledged it before the 2019 election. Obviously, then events intervened, the pandemic, etc. And that's why we had the issues that built up over a number of years, and that's why we've got the problems now. I think looking to the future, over the next 12 months or so, I think unfortunately the NHS is going to face another very difficult winter, meaning the DHSC department is just going to be focused on that rather than actually developing the kind of social care reforms you need, along with that kind of crackdown you were alluding to in the comments there.
Is it wrong in principle? What do you think of what NADRA says? Wrong in principle to ask care workers to come here from abroad without family?
I mean, there's always a difficult balance to be worn off, between the two. I think that it's going to be obviously difficult to kind of keep the incentives up without increasing pay. I mean, there's a trade-off involved here, and I'm not sure the government's really been honest about that over the past few years.
I'm not sure conversations about humanity or inhumanity are the best way to look at this. It is about, do we want these people to come and work in our social care sector or not? If we want them to come because we have mass shortages, because we refuse to train up our own care workers and pay them wages that mean British people will do those jobs, which is the strategy at the moment, then we do need people to come. It's not about whether it's humane or not. It's about, will they make that decision? If they don't make that decision, then you've got a choice. Do you want fewer social care places at a time when pressure is increasing, or do you want to increase taxes so you can pay British workers more to do those jobs? I don't think the government has suggested that it wants to go down either of those routes. We all talk about the need to train more NHS workers and social care workers, but not really the long-term funding available in order to do that. So what you're talking about now in the next 5 to 10 years is more pressure on a social care system that is already falling apart.
Which one would you do? What would you do in terms of the options just been set out by Rachel?
And I think we could look at making it a more skilled occupation that is attractive to homegrown people. There's a training need that's missing there. It's sort of seen, I don't know, my late mother had.
But you don't want to spend any money. We know that from the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves.
No, we will spend money. We want growth. That's what we want. That was the Keir Starmer speech. Were you not paying attention, Jo?
I was, actually. I was hoping you were too. But yes, the growth fairy. Yes, the growth fairy is going to solve absolutely everything. But in the meantime, what would you do in the situation? How do you get people off the economically inactive list, of which there is a sizable number, into doing these jobs that NADRA needs filling?
NHS waiting lists? I mean, again, there's a lot of people on those, millions of people who could be working. I mean, just everything, nothing seems better than it was 13, nearly 14 years ago.
Well, and that is true. I mean, the waiting list, as we know, it's millions, 7 million people on the waiting list. Those make up most of those people who are economically inactive, along with people who've retired and don't want to work.
we didn't have a COVID pandemic 13 years ago. This
We had
is
a waiting list crisis before
we
COVID,
had waiting lists before COVID, but we have had a huge increase in waiting lists because of the impact of COVID and the way it was handled. We've absolutely got to make sure that those people who are being prevented from gainful employment and from working because of illnesses can get that treatment as soon as possible. We've got to prioritise some of these. There's an awful lot of people who are not active in the workplace who could be, and we've got to get them into the workplace as well, which is why the government's brought forward the measures recently.
And Labour are very clear they oppose the Rwanda plan, as you have repeated today. But there isn't any difference, is there, materially, between what the government is proposing to bring down net migration and what Labour would do? You agree pretty well with all of the proposals, the 5-point plan?
We have a plan, our own 5-point plan from the summer.
But which bit do you not agree with? You've just said it's a bit high, but you're in favour or broadly support the idea of hiking the minimum salary threshold.
I think it should go to the correct body to determine what that amount is. And also my staff, I have to say, that are all in their 20s, they're a bit annoyed that the other way around, they can't fall in love abroad, marry someone and bring them here, because that salary threshold applies to our people too.
Right, well, coming back to that issue, you were nodding away there. Why?
I think it's a really important issue, and I think it's something that the people who drafted this announcement probably didn't think about, the fact that 3/4 of Brits are not going to earn enough to be able to marry a foreign spouse. And if you think about the fact that you probably want to get married in your 20s or early 30s when your earning potential is lower than in your 60s, that's going to affect an awful lot of young people. I think the message it sends that British people don't have the right to fall in love with who they want to and to bring their spouse, bring their children over here when they themselves are British, I think that's a massive oversight. It's more than doubled the amount that you have to be earning to bring over a foreign spouse. I think it was a mistake. I don't think it speaks to Conservative values. And I hope that now it has been raised and recognised, there will be a U-turn on that.
James, do you think there will be?
I think that when you actually start to realise the impact on individuals, that will be when you have sort of MPs who are facing in their constituency offices, people coming in with stories about husbands, wives. That will make it harder. What I would say, I do think there is perhaps a stronger argument, given the way inflation has enacted the last couple of years, that for the fiscal drag to take account of this 26,200 to be increased, maybe not to 38,000, but this was a point someone was making to be in government yesterday, was that, you know, that's what Boris Johnson should have really done, is increased it with the visa cap in line with inflation as it was rising.
Can we also have tax thresholds rising according to
fiscal
drag and inflation?
That'd
be nice too, wouldn't it?
We'll go,
You've also got a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who both have spouses from other countries, so you'd think that they would recognise that falling in love with someone who doesn't happen to be British is a thing that some
and having to earn then nearly £39,000. I mean, listening to all of this, Tim, when we go back to the original figure, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, says he wants to cut net migration by 300,000. It was a record high of 745,000 for the year ending 2022. Why only 300,000?
Well, if you look at what those figures are made up of, so the net figure to the end of September was 672,000, of which 150,000 were from Hong Kong and 200,000 were from Ukraine. Now, hopefully, Ukraine is going to be a one-off, and that figure is obviously going to go into the negative, but we don't know for how much longer that's going to take. A large chunk of it was dependence visas, which have gone up hugely because of the scandals, which Nadia has just acknowledged as well.
Well, I've got the numbers. I've got the numbers here for the visas, actually.
When you unpick all those figures, which of those groups do you not actually want to come here? So I don't have a problem with the numbers around immigration. What I have a problem with is that we make sure we've got people coming here for whom we have gainful employment, who will contribute to the economy, integrate, pay taxes, and upskill and grow our whole economy. That's what it's all about. If we are bringing in these limits, because we cannot afford to bring dependents from overseas who are not going to be contributing to our economy, if they can't be sustained by their own families. That's what it's all about.
Nadra, what do you make of what you've heard?
Well, I think it's good to know that there's some agreement around the mess that was made out with the immigration system, which has allowed that level of immigration of dependence that we've been talking about, because that's where that came from, the unregistered services that were given those visas. But I do think we've got to think very, very carefully. I understand the rationale behind all of this, but we do need to think very, very carefully about how we get that domestic workforce in place. And the only way we're going to do that is if we acknowledge this is a skilled profession. We get a plan in place. We talk about social care and try and get that deficit down from that 15 billion that is low, and we start to be able to pay our workforce better. But to assume that anybody can do the job is wrong, because I would ask any of the politicians on the panel today and anybody listening to actually go and do a shift in a care home and see how it feels.
Well, I'm sure that would be very instructive. Nadra Ahmed, thank you very much for joining us. Just before we move on, very briefly, Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, said we're going to use these measures to reduce net migration because we want to build a socially more cohesive society, which is impossible with such large numbers coming into the UK. What did he mean?
Well, I think it's self-evident, and we had this with the illegal migration figures as well. When you have a big surge in numbers coming to the country in a disorganised way, who haven't come legally.
Legal migration is in an organised way. The government's chosen to have visas sent out to the numbers of 745,000. I know it's not all of it because of the visas from Hong Kong and Ukraine, but the government's chosen that since Brexit.
Within those figures, Jo, as I've just said, there are large numbers of people who we brought here legally and safely from different countries, from Afghanistan, from Syria onwards. When you're taking large numbers of people like that legally, and we have a duty to do that, I think most people will agree, it's not just a case of plonking them in houses and then hoping it will all work. We've got to assimilate them, we've got to integrate them, we've got to look after them with support services.
But the government has chosen on net migration. I understand that, but I suppose the government only has itself to blame in that regard. But Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury himself, said he'd like to see the numbers at around 250,000. So he wants them to be even lower.
Oh, it's above my pay grade, the exact figure.
Oh, well, is that all you've got to say on that?
But look, we've had a very positive experience and an enriching experience in this country of legal migration. I'm a product of it. My father was directly recruited by the Prudential Assurance Company to be an articled clerk in 1961.
Other good insurance companies are available.
Thank you. Product placement. A little pause with immigration because there was a big vote last night. If we just show you this headline, BBC News: ministers lose infected blood vote after Tory MPs revolt. It was the first defeat for the government in the House of Commons last night when 22 Conservatives voted with Labour to bring in legislation to speed up compensation for victims of the infected blood scandal by the NHS. You were one of them. Why?
Well, contrary to popular opinion, I don't vote against the government often, and here it seemed
to... it was fun, wasn't it, Tim? We were in the same lobby. We were all in it together yesterday.
That wasn't the fun bit of it. So it just seemed that the government clutched defeat from the jaws of victory. This government has done more than any before on recognising the scandal of the contaminated blood. Theresa May set up the inquiry. Sure. It's reported. Interim payments have been paid out.
They've waited so long.
But the problem is they've waited so long, and there is really no excuse for not getting on with it. So what I voted for last night was for the government's policy, but just to get on with it. Yeah. So actually everything that we wanted to see last night, the government has agreed to. So can we just get on with it? Because the scandal has gone back.
And I'm sure all the families of all the victims will very much feel the same. Let's talk about house building. This headline here: government's annual house building target not yet met, figures show. The promise is to build 300,000 homes a year. There were 234,000, just over, net additional dwellings, they call it in England, last year. But Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has vowed to back the builders, not blockers, by building 1.5 million homes over 5 years if Labour wins the election. Let's have a listen to him.
You will always get, and quite understandably and rightly, individual MPs standing up for the communities in their patch. The role of government is obviously different. The role of government is to deliver on big projects, and we're going to have to get that balance right. I'm not saying we'll do...
But I guess what I'm asking you is this. Are you going to do something to that local opposition that isn't done now? Are you basically going to say, we hear you, but I'm afraid we're ignoring you?
Yes, we're going to have to do that.
Well, let's take a look at this headline in The Times. Labour MPs could spoil Keir Starmer's affordable homes plan. The Times has reported that 49 Labour MPs have tried to block more than 4,500 affordable homes in their constituencies since 2019. Rupert, your name was mentioned in the article. You opposed a large development of Ealing Council's headquarters. Here is the story on it. Ealing Council scraps plans, 26-storey tower at council headquarters, which would have created 477 homes. Why?
Yes, so I think there's a bit of misunderstanding here, because Tim knows this and I know this, that MPs cannot block housing policies. It's a local authority thing.
You can try.
But as a local citizen, you can raise your voice in
So
this.
why did you?
So this particular one, actually, the developer pulled out in the end because it was a series of tower blocks. So since this application started, we had the Grenfell disaster. And as a West London MP, you can see Grenfell Tower from bits of my seat. There are new provisions, safety measures now that are required, that you have to have 2 staircases in every tall block.
Fine.
So this private developer didn't want to foot the bill for those, so they withdrew. And I argued at the planning committee that we should put in 2 means of escape, it's called, because that way the fire brigade can bring up their equipment up one and people can get out. And that was a very serious failing with Grenfell Tower that only had 1 and was clad in that horrible stuff.
Right, but you heard Keir Starmer, leader of your party, saying that we are going to fight the blockers. Are you a blocker when it comes to building new homes?
On that development, yes, but not on every development. And I think our plan for 1.5 million new homes, primarily on brownfield sites, greyfield sites, I've argued long that lots of our green belt is not really green belt. We've got bits in the Borough of Ealing that are ugly scrubland. Build on those as well.
Have you blocked any other developments?
As I said, we can't block developments. Well, that was the only one that
opposed. Can you oppose
that was
them?
That was the only one, the only housing development I've spoken at a planning thing, because there's a committee kind of every week.
So you haven't opposed. You haven't.
I think on your show, a naughty correspondent said.
Well, it was one of our other guests.
Everything that's over 2 stories. It's not possible because there's a planning committee every week.
All right, James. What do you make of this? I mean, this is Keir Starmer's big plan. How hard is it going to be?
Well, he's saying all the right things, isn't he? But the question is, are you going to replace a Tory MP with a blue rosette, with a Labour MP with a red rosette? Are the incentives really going to change? I'm quite sceptical of that. I think basically Labour needs to have a real plan to get this through. It needs to be a sort of centre point of a 5-year plan of a parliament, get it done in years 1 and 2 so the effects will wear off by 3 and 4 in terms of the rebellion, etc. And I think it's going to be very difficult, and I think they ought to know the lessons of the 2019 parliament in terms of getting MPs to vote for something, because of course there was the failure of the Boris Johnson reforms of early 2021. So I think they need to learn the lessons and really make it a centre point. So he can talk a lot about it now and also make the point about the economic consequences of this, which is that, as he's been saying earlier this year, for every 100,000 new homes you get about 1% of growth. That means more money in things like social care, health, etc. So I think he's got a lot of work to do, and I remain to be seen if he'll actually deliver on it.
Rachel?
So I think all of the parties are maybe not equally bad, but very bad on this, because the incentives are set up in such a way that a local constituency MP has a duty to represent their constituents. Generally, residents don't want new housing in their area. They're very happy with things the way they are. They like their views, they like their car parking spaces, and they don't have any responsibility to think about people who might want to move to the area, who can't buy a home, who can't even rent a home because those homes don't exist, whereas the government does have a duty to those people, to everyone, and the tension between constituency MPs and the government is basically why we've had so few homes being built. And Keir Starmer is going to run into the same problems that Conservative Prime Ministers have done. One thing he could do, though, is he could support mass house building projects in Conservative seats if he were in power. The Conservative governments of the last 13 years could have done that. They could have had mass house building projects in Labour areas with Labour MPs. Labour MPs would have objected, and the Conservative governments could have said, sorry, we're building them anyway. They didn't. Sorry, Conservatives, that's your loss. Keir Starmer, if you're listening, build some houses in Tory seats.
It might involve some creative thinking as well in terms of, devolving tax powers to local areas, etc., whereby you have an incentive to bring in more people there so you can get more money for investing council services. So it might not just be about building new homes and trying the same old formula. It could be broader thinking of the economy, perhaps.
Well, I wonder if Keir Starmer was listening to all the helpful advice from both of you, and from the New Statesman, from Rachel there. I mean, you were chuckling along. Is that because you know how difficult it's been, because there are MPs, maybe you included, who have also opposed plans in your constituency, and these new homes never get built?
OK, full disclosure, I've opposed plans for housing my constituency. I've also supported some plans which are controversial in my constituency. And the problem is, if you take away that local link for people to be able to have their say, constituencies like mine, we're all a special case.
Yes.
But over half of my constituency is in the national park, and to the south of my constituency, it's the sea. So I'm really constrained. We have virtually no open spaces left. We've got 43 houseboats, so we can put more people on boats potentially, but we've got real infrastructure constraints about where physically you can put them. We have to be smarter on this. All the parties have failed on this. We have a crisis. I have 3 kids in their 20s who are nowhere near being able to afford their own houses. We have absolutely got to build more houses. We need to be smarter, and I think the only way we are going to get mass house building is by a bold programme of new towns.
So do you support Keir Starmer? I mean, on the rhetoric so far, because we don't know yet what will happen, but on the rhetoric and what he's outlined, it's an ambitious plan, isn't it?
I don't know, because whether it's going to be their policy or not, I don't actually know what he's.
Well, he says he's going to ignore. He will ignore local concerns.
Is that the way we are going to deliver the numbers we need is by ambitious new towns where you build the infrastructure in with it. So you get the roads that could go into it, the schools that are on site, so you don't have other people complaining there are no places left in the schools. You have GPs and health facilities as part of a big new town structure.
Right, we'll come on to the new town. Well, we'll talk about the new towns because that's another part of Keir Starmer's big plan, to bulldoze through planning, to ignore the concerns that have been raised by both Rachel and James, perhaps concerns raised by you if you're still an MP after the next election. What do you say to Keir Starmer? Should he beware?
I think his plan is a very good one for the new towns. And actually, if you read the detail of it, there will be more local consultation from an earlier stage. Because this was a plan that, you know, by the time they'd done all these plans, thousands of people wrote into me. It was not suitable. I do advice surgery every week. And the main thing people come in with is housing, family-sized housing. That was units of sort of one bedroom and studio flats.
Sure, so but the principle here, I mean, Tim, James raised the issue that a few years ago, Rishi Sunak, they got rid of the targets, the house building targets. Why was that wrong? Why is that wrong? Otherwise, they never get built.
Because targets are so arbitrary. And so where you've got constituencies like mine, where you do not have the spaces left, why should we be subject to nationally drawn up
well, why?
targets?
Why, Rachel? I have the answer to that. Because maybe you want young people living in your area. Maybe you want teachers in the schools or workers in the supermarkets. Maybe you want social care workers to care for the elderly population. Maybe if you want a vibrant community that has people of all ages and that has a vibrant economy, and you don't want complaints about the local primary school closing because parents can't afford to live in that area because there are no houses, then you have to have some compromises. I completely agree that the infrastructure and the services, the public services, need to be there as well. And a big part of this is holding developers to account when they promise that those facilities and services will be available and they don't materialise. But fundamentally, if you let local residents block any development that might inconvenience them in any way,
Rachel,
the answer is going to be empty towns.
I don't disagree with much of that, but in the southeast of England particularly, the most densely populated part of the country, you don't address all those problems by just making it more densely populated, because the young people who are brought up in the area cannot afford to stay in their area and have to move away. That's one of the biggest problems. There are new people coming into the area. We need to spread the burden across the whole of the United Kingdom much more fairly than
Except there are so many MPs who aren't willing. I mean, how many developments have you been against, Rupert? I mean, Tim has said he's been, as you said too, been in favour of some and against some. But I mean, have you?
So in 8 years, 2 planning committees. The other one was a hotel, so it wasn't residential.
You've expressed
that one and this one. And the hotel because it was destroying a historic snooker hall.
Otherwise, you haven't expressed concerns about
That's
any
the
other
2 planning committees. As I said, I could not go every week because I have a job that requires me to vote on an evening in the House of Commons.
I just make the point as well. It's not just housing, of course, as well. There's other things like energy and even things like the prison sector with jails crumbling. If you want to build new infrastructure, unfortunately, there is an instinctive reaction to oppose all new ways which are actually going to boost the economy and get the growth, because it's all concentrated opposition and diffuse benefits.
And railways as well, HS2.
I mean, Simon Clarke is a former Tory Cabinet Secretary of State who worries that the next generation of Conservatives just won't be there. There won't be people voting Conservative because, as you've said about your children, they can't afford to live anywhere.
Well, this was the Thatcherite argument in the 80s, which is that because people had something to conserve, they became Conservatives. And frankly, I think that is why you're seeing the average age at which you switch from voting Labour to Tory getting older and older in British politics.
We have a big day tomorrow, again in Westminster, because Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, is going to appear for 2 days in front of the COVID inquiry. We'll show you this headline. Boris Johnson to apologise to COVID inquiry, but say he got big calls right. He's been preparing long and hard for this appearance because he will be asked to give evidence on the decisions that were taken by him and his government about the timing of lockdowns and about whether more lives could have been saved. So he will be doing that from tomorrow morning. We will bring you, of course, all of the key parts of his evidence to that inquiry tomorrow on Politics Live. We're back on air at 11:15 and we will also have Prime Minister's questions. You're going to be there too, aren't you, Rachel, covering it?
Watching Boris Johnson, absolutely.
Yes, and of course watching Politics Live. But that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today, and I'll see you tomorrow at 11:15. Bye-bye.